brother David was convinced of the authenticity of the shroud because he had read the stuff online that is in abundance. The research that has been done using all kinds of metrics that I've only recently come into use. All right. So when the carbon-14 dating information came out, so many people really expressed considerable doubt that however they did that experiment, there had to have been a flaw. And then during the course of the 80s and 90s, the flaws came out. That the part of the cloth that was studied and came up with a 13th century date was the part of the cloth that was most frequently handled by people when they would display the relic, okay, so that it contained the sweat and the natural oils from people's palms, embedded into the fabric. All right. And then the bacteria that also would create a certain kind of plaque on the fibers at those points. That was the cloth that was used. All right. That was the part of the cloth that was tested, because obviously being on the edge, it wouldn't damage the image. Right. All right. So you fix one thing, you wreck another. But meanwhile, then they do this amazing research with optics. And they show, well, all right, this is a cloth lying on somebody's face, right? So how would it be that you'd get this image of a face, right? Because it would be distorted. And then they worked on the distortion principle of contact with the cloth and came up with a lot of really remarkable information, which we could go on all afternoon talking about. The idea that they could see, for example, the coins on the eyes, that there were silhouettes of flowers on the chest, that the strand of hair that an Orthodox Jew would allow to grow is there. Wow. There's a lot of incredible details. The wounds, of course, the wounds of the crown of thorns, the wounds of the hands and the feet. They're in the wrist. They're not in the palm of the hand. They're in the wrist, which is anatomically more believable. The wound in the side, the exact form of the whip ends that were used, the little metal pieces that were tied onto the end of the leather whips that were used for the flagellation, that you can see the form, the silhouette of those little dumbbell-shaped pieces of metal on the back of Christ and across his legs. There are so many things that are visible on the shroud. Many things were visible already in the original photographs from 1898, but once you started doing it with, image enhancement technology, you got, almost a world of information there. But the thing that really hits us theologically is when we start talking about the actual cloth that was used. It was not the usual cloth that would have been used for a shroud. It's this herringbone weave linen of very high quality, very expensive, that would have only been used for either royal garb or, above all, temple use, for the vestments of the priests and for cloths placed on the sacred altars in the temple in Jerusalem. All right, now, who would have had access to that kind of material? Well, we have these two figures, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, who are described as the people who brought Jesus's body down from the cross. All right, so the great paintings of the deposition always have Mary of Magdalene, John, the Blessed Mother, and then these two men who were distinguished members of the Sanhedrin, all right, bringing down the body from the cross. Now, they come up with this very long stretch of cloth, it's double the length, more than double the length of a human body, and they place Jesus's body in it and fold it over his head. So there's a front and back, all right, with the loose end down at the feet. And then he's placed on the slab in this tomb, okay? But the fact that they use that cloth already suggests that, at least to these two distinguished, naturally highly trained rabbinic leaders, right, they are saying this death is no ordinary death.
Mm.
This death is a sacrifice, a prophetic sign in the form of a sacrifice that has something to do with the cleansing of the whole world, you know. All right, so that you remember in John's gospel, they quote Caiaphas as saying one man should die for the people, right? And that's identified as prophetic.
Yeah.
But already within hours of the crucifixion itself, we have two distinguished rabbis saying this is a death to end all deaths, all right, to end sin, to end, it is an atonement death, okay? And this is incredible because, you know, most people would say, oh, this idea of the atonement, that Jesus' death was a sacrifice, atoning for our sins, is a theological idea that comes in later as Christians read the prophetic texts, especially in Isaiah, that refer to the suffering servant. But here, these guys are getting it while Jesus is still dying on the cross. They understood.
Wow.
Now, from the point of view, even from we're talking about, if we're talking about spiritual experiences, mystical experiences, so on and so forth, could it be that having been with Jesus and having been his, you might say, inner circle secret disciples, not the 12, but this sort of esoteric group that was very passionately attached to Jesus, could it be that they already knew as much as Peter, James, and John about the light body of Jesus?
Mm.
They already knew that Jesus was much more than a prophet, a preacher, a holy man, a healer.
Mm.
You know, that his role in the world was something beyond the ordinary. And so they were, in a certain sense, ready for what was going to happen. And that maybe, you know, just as, I mean, this just occurred to me now that we're talking about it, but how many people have been deeply transformed and converted simply by meditating on the Passion of Christ?
Yeah.
You
Yes.
know, when you realize the degree of love that is present in that, well, there they are at the real thing. How
Yes.
could they not be moved? How
Yeah.
could they not be
Well,
moved?
and that's actually, I mean, that perspective um, really supports some of the work I've been doing with the anthropologist um, Rene Girard.
Ah, there you go. Yes,
Yeah, my,
yes.
my dissertation is all about the the fourth gospel from a Girardian perspective, the sacrifice to end all sacrifices.
Mhm.
Um, and actually, you mentioned that Caiaphas, it is better for one person to die than for the whole nation to be destroyed. I mean, that's basically Girard mimetic theory summed up in one sentence. And I remember the first academic paper I presented was on that, and it was at Iona College
Oh,
near where
wow.
I grew up. Yeah, in New Rochelle. But something else you mentioned about the shroud that I remember you mentioning in a video, how people who claim it's a forgery, you say, well, as somebody who studies art and as an artist yourself, there's no style to it,
Yeah.
um, and the idea of somebody forging that sounds like that would be almost as big of a miracle as the resurrection, right? Because like, how could somebody create something like that, especially even around the 13th century? So
Well, even looking at the tree behind you, you know,
yeah,
I mean, yeah, we know it's a tree because our mind, having had experiences of perceiving trees, knows that that's a picture of a tree, but it's clearly a work of art.
right.
All right. It's enhanced in many ways with color and texture and so forth. All right. When you look at the shroud, there is no enhancement. There is no style. There's no period. You couldn't say, oh, this is, yeah, the Gothic Christ or the Byzantine Christ. In fact, the image of Christ on the shroud was known well enough in Byzantium that it did influence icons and even coins. We do know that that is part of the history of the shroud and its peregrinations in the Middle East and in Byzantium before it came to Europe. But the fact of the matter is that not only is it not a work of art, but it has encoded in it uh, optical phenomena that no artist, not even the greatest artist in history, not even Leonardo, would have been able to reproduce on a cloth. And of course, if you look at on our microscope at the fibrils of the cloth, the image itself is burned into the uppermost fibrils of the woven linen cloth, which is, some people have tried to warm up an iron statue and then apply a linen cloth to it to try to get that effect. You don't get that effect. The closest that people have gotten is with some kind of a laser that will just burn the upper fibrils. But then lasers are what? Concentrated light. And so you're back to step one. How did this light come out of the entire body of a presumably dead human being?